Ever left a family gathering early just to protect your peace?
My sister Rachel always knew how to steal a room, and the worst part was, she didn't even need to try. She had that kind of effortless charm that made people lean in when she talked, nod like disciples, laugh at stories that weren't even that funny. She was the kind of woman who wore chaos like perfume and made it smell expensive. I, on the other hand, was the one who learned how to disappear early on. You don't forget the sound of your own voice being talked over at the dinner table, or the way your parents beam just a little brighter when she walks in, even if you got there first. And you damn sure don't forget when your own sister holds up a letter you wrote in hope, waves it around in front of everyone like it's a joke, and says, NASA? Oh honey, let's keep our feet on Earth, okay? That Thanksgiving was 5 years ago, and I remember every clink of silverware that followed. I was 39, sitting there with a trembling jaw and a smile so forced it made my molars ache. My dad chuckled, my mom sipped her wine and muttered something about how ambition was fine, as long as it stays realistic, and Rachel laughed louder than everyone, like she'd just delivered the punchline of the night. She read the whole thing out loud. Every line. I still remember her voice mimicking mine. I've studied orbital mechanics and trajectory corrections for deep space applications, and then she threw in a fake gasp and said, "She's gonna build Mars rovers, y'all." I left early that night. Didn't even make it to dessert. Told them I had a migraine, which was true, but not the kind that painkillers fix. I cried in the car in the parking lot of the Safeway down the street, watched the windshield fog up while people walked past in coats, probably rushing home to their own families who didn't treat dreams like jokes. That was the last family event I attended for over a year. I didn't send Christmas cards. I didn't answer calls. And I sure as hell didn't talk to Rachel. Not after she texted me a few days later with, "Hey, don't be so sensitive. You know I love you. I just didn't want you getting your hopes up too high." I buried myself in my work after that. Aerospace analytics isn't glamorous. You won't see it in movies. There's no badge or ceremony or shiny stage. But it's real. It's painstaking, detail-obsessed, behind-the-scenes work that keeps satellites from crashing into each other and helps spacecraft find their way back when things go wrong. I stopped telling people what I did for a while. Got tired of blank stares. Stopped hoping anyone in my family would ever understand why I'd chosen a path where I wasn't front and center. Then last month, out of nowhere, I got a letter. Not an email. A real letter with a NASA seal and a watermark I ran my fingers over twice. It was a commendation, not a promotion, not a trophy, but something rarer. It said my analysis during the Artemis data loss recovery window had directly contributed to mission stability. They were submitting my name for internal nomination. Internal doesn't mean press. It doesn't mean the world will know. But I would. And that was enough. Or it would have been. Until Rachel popped back up like clockwork. It was an ivory envelope with gold lettering and a floral border that made my eyes roll. Inside, a handwritten invitation from Rachel to her garden party, celebrating my feature in American Lifestyle magazine. Backyard brunch, catered, where something fabulous. She even drew a little heart next to her name. No mention of the fact that we hadn't spoken in over 2 years, or that the last thing she'd said to me was a half-hearted apology after publicly shredding my confidence in front of our entire extended family. I almost threw it away. I actually held it over the trash. But something about it made me pause. Not because I wanted to go. God no. But because of the date. The party was set for the same weekend I'd planned to frame my commendation letter for my home office. The timing, it was poetic. Karmic, even. For a woman who once laughed at my dreams, now to invite me to clap for hers? To gather and admire her magazine spread like she was being canonized? That night I didn't sleep much. I stayed up, staring at that letter, then at mine. Hers full of glitter, mine full of gravity. I thought about my flight jacket, the official one, navy blue with a mission patch stitched just above the heart. I thought about how Rachel always said, try not to dress like a utility worker, and how she'd probably be in something silk, flowing, camera-ready. I thought about how, maybe just once, I wouldn't downplay who I am to make her feel better about who she pretends to be. And so, I RSVP'd yes. Just one word. No smiley face. No comment. I picked out a plain black turtleneck, jeans, boots. Nothing flashy. But I took that jacket off its hanger and laid it on the bed. I folded the commendation letter into my purse, tucked behind my wallet, and said nothing to anyone. Not even my boyfriend. The morning of the party, I drove out to the suburbs, through winding roads lined with new money homes that all looked like Pinterest boards come to life. Her house was white stone with black shutters, and the backyard was already buzzing with people carrying mimosas and smiling too wide. I parked far enough down the street so I wouldn't be noticed arriving, took a breath, zipped up the jacket, and walked through the gate like I belonged there. Which, ironically, I did. Maybe more than ever. Rachel saw me the second I stepped onto the lawn. Her face did that fake flicker surprise thing, like she hadn't expected me to actually show up. She was in a blush pink dress, something flowing that made her look like a magazine ad for sangria. She was posing with two guests mid-laugh, drink in hand. She excused herself, glided toward me, and then came the line, predictable as sunrise and twice as petty. "Try not to outshine me today," she said with a smile that never reached her eyes. I didn't say a word. Just nodded slightly, shifted my purse strap on my shoulder, and let her get a good, long look at the NASA patch on my chest. She blinked. Once. Then looked away. I watched her scan the crowd, check to see who might have noticed. Her smile twitched. And I swear, just for a second, I saw something in her face I'd never seen before. Nervousness. It was the first flicker. And I hadn't even said a thing. The thing about revenge, the kind that isn't loud or theatrical or made for TV, is that it doesn't need fireworks to work. It doesn't come with screaming matches or shattered glasses or people storming out of rooms. It comes quietly, like fog rolling over a field, slow and certain and all-consuming. And as I stepped deeper into Rachel's backyard, careful not to make a single noise louder than my breath, I could already feel the first wisps of it curling around the carefully curated scene she had built for herself. The grass was trimmed like it had been cut with scissors, the buffet table was draped in ivory linen and topped with tiny handwritten signs for each dish, and string lights hung above the guests like something out of a home design magazine. The scent of citrus and sweet basil floated through the air, and in the distance, I could hear the faint chords of some soft acoustic playlist, probably named Brunch Vibes or something equally manufactured. Rachel always had a talent for packaging things herself most of all. Her voice lifted above the others as she welcomed a new couple arriving through the side gate, her arms wide open, her laughter precise, loud enough to signal that she was the host, the star, the one who made this happen. And in a way, she always had been. The one who made things happen, that is. Not by force, but by presence. She could command attention just by walking into a room, tilt her head a certain way, flash that curated smile, and people leaned in like she was about to whisper a secret worth remembering. It was a skill I never envied so much as observed, like a scientist watching a phenomenon she couldn't replicate. I stood near the drink station and poured myself a lemonade, the good kind with real pulp and crushed mint. I hadn't even been there 5 minutes before someone approached me, a man in a light blue button-down shirt and salt and pepper beard, holding a camera with a shoulder strap that looked worn from years of use. His voice was casual, but direct, the way photographers always seem to be, like they've been trained to spot something worth framing before they even know why. "That's an official NASA jacket, isn't it?" he asked, nodding toward my chest without looking directly at me. I didn't give him a speech. I didn't launch into qualifications or titles or resumes. I just nodded and said, "Yeah. Flight Operations Division." I sipped the lemonade and watched his brow lift, subtle but unmistakable. "Mind if I grab a couple shots?" he asked. "You've got a great look, sharp, authentic. Real contrast to all this pastel going on." He gestured toward the pale blues and soft yellows that clothed most of the guests, including Rachel, who had changed into her second outfit of the day, white linen pants and a coral blouse that looked better in photos than it probably felt to wear in the sun. I shrugged and said, "Sure," because it didn't feel like a big deal. But then I saw Rachel notice. She was halfway through telling some story to a group near the mimosas, and when she saw the man lift his camera toward me, her voice faltered, just for a second. She kept talking, of course, but her eyes lingered, trying to make sense of the moment, probably assuming I had asked for attention when I hadn't done anything except show up and say yes. The photographer introduced himself as Jason, and it turned out he wasn't just a guest. He was hired by the magazine to document the party for a follow-up spread. Candid shots, behind-the-scenes vibes, he explained, snapping one frame after another, circling me like he was trying to catch a story I wasn't telling out loud. He asked me what I did at NASA, and I gave him the simplest version possible: data analytics for flight safety systems, orbital projection models, nothing too flashy but critical all the same. He paused and said, "So, like, if something's about to crash into something else, you help prevent it?" And I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was exactly the kind of thing my family never thought to ask. Rachel came over just as Jason lowered his camera to glance at the screen. She wrapped her arm around my shoulder like it was the most natural thing in the world, like we were sisters straight out of a Hallmark movie and not two people who hadn't made eye contact in years. "This is my sister Emma," she said sweetly, too sweetly, like honey left out in the sun. "She's brilliant. Total genius. Works with rockets or something, right, Em?" Her voice was sharp beneath the sugar. I smiled, polite, restrained. "Orbital systems analytics," I corrected gently, not to show off, but to be clear. Jason raised an eyebrow, clearly more interested than before. "That's what I thought," he said. "I swear I've seen your name on a report from the Artemis program. Simmons, right? Emma Simmons." Rachel's hand stiffened slightly on my shoulder, and I could feel her exhale through her nose. Not loud, but just enough to notice. I said nothing. Jason kept snapping shots, and I let him. Let the camera record what Rachel couldn't erase. Me, unbothered, centered, not hiding behind anyone's shadow for once. She excused herself after a minute, her smile frozen in place, and I watched her retreat to the drinks table, pulling out her phone like she needed an urgent text, but I knew she was just trying to find control again. The party went on. Laughter, clinking glasses, women posing near flower arrangements. But something had shifted in the air, subtle but irreversible. People started drifting over to ask me questions. Not interview style, just curious. "What's it like to work with NASA? Do you actually know what all those acronyms mean? Is space as scary as it looks on TV?" I gave them what they asked for, measured, simple, honest answers. I didn't embellish. I didn't name drop. I didn't need to. And all the while, Rachel kept hovering near the center like a satellite losing orbit. Smiling, smiling, always smiling. But she saw what I saw. Her own photographer was spending more time capturing me than her. And the worst part? I wasn't even trying. By the time the sun started to soften and the lights began to flicker on overhead, Rachel came by again, her voice just a touch higher than before. "So, she said, drawing the word out like she was stretching taffy, "what made you decide to wear that?" Her eyes flicked to my jacket. "It's not exactly brunch chic." I turned to her, slow and measured, the way you turn a key in a lock you've never opened before. "I didn't know there was a dress code," I said, my tone cool but not cruel. "I just wore what felt like me. And, maybe for the first time in my life, I meant it." Rachel laughed, too loud, like she was performing for someone nearby. "Well," she said, blinking fast, "at least Jason's getting some variety." Her words were supposed to sound light, but I caught the tremor underneath, the way she gripped her wine glass a little too tightly. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Jason called from across the yard, asking if I'd mind stepping over to the ivy wall for a few portraits with natural light. I said sure. And as I walked past Rachel, my boots crunching softly on the gravel path, I felt the weight of something lift, not just old resentment, but the years I'd spent shrinking so she could expand. I wasn't there to steal her spotlight. I was just done pretending I didn't have one of my own. And when I looked back once, just briefly, I saw her standing still, glass half raised, mouth half open, watching me walk away. Not angry. Not jealous. Just confused. As if she couldn't quite understand how someone she had so thoroughly dismissed could simply exist in the same space and still, somehow, outshine her without even trying. There is a particular kind of power and restraint, a kind that doesn't demand the floor or raise its voice or slam the door on the way out, but instead lingers in the air like heat after a thunderstorm. Present and undeniable even though nothing appears to be happening on the surface, and as I stood near the ivy wall with Jason snapping his third or fourth round of photos, his camera clicking steadily while guests slowly drifted closer, watching from over their champagne glasses and carefully curated smiles, I realized that I had finally, without ever meaning to, stepped into the kind of presence that Rachel had always claimed as her own, and it was not loud, not grand, not showy, but it was real, and it was mine. Jason worked like someone who had seen too many artificial smiles and was now hunting for something that felt grounded, something that didn't need gloss to be interesting. He asked me about the mission patch, about how long I'd been at NASA, about whether I ever thought of quitting during the years no one seemed to care about what I was doing, and I answered simply, not out of modesty, but because the facts didn't need inflation. They carried their own weight, even if only a few people ever bothered to notice. I told him I'd been with NASA for 16 years, most of it spent in a windowless office analyzing numbers most people would find unreadable, and that I'd never quit. Though there were years I'd come home feeling like I was building a cathedral brick by brick in the middle of a forest where no one would ever see it. He paused after that, looked up from the lens, and said, "Well, they're seeing it now," and though I didn't say anything in response, a part of me nodded in agreement, quiet, settled, as though some long-buried piece of me had finally been unearthed. Across the yard, Rachel was standing with a small group of women from her yoga class, perfect hair, expensive sunglasses resting on top of their heads like they were born that way, and though she was smiling, animated, gesturing with one hand while holding her glass in the other, she kept glancing in my direction, her eyes narrowing slightly each time she saw another guest stop by to ask me something, or worse, to just stand near me. As if proximity alone might help them absorb whatever it was that had shifted in the air. The irony, of course, was that I had no plan, no speech, no performance. I hadn't come to compete, hadn't come to take her moment, hadn't even come to be noticed. But Rachel, who had lived her whole life under the assumption that visibility was currency, couldn't seem to understand that sometimes presence, not performance, draws attention in ways you can't predict or control. It wasn't long before someone from our past appeared, and as with most things I should have seen coming, I didn't. His name was Daniel Holbrook, and in high school he'd been the star of the swim team and Rachel's on-again, off-again boyfriend, though the off-again parts had usually coincided with his failed attempts to flirt with me in the library when Rachel wasn't around. I hadn't seen him in over 20 years, but time had softened his jawline and thinned his hair, and yet the moment he saw me, his face lit up with a recognition that felt sharper than it should have. "Emma Simmons," he said, shaking his head with the kind of awe people reserve for comebacks they didn't see coming. "Didn't expect to see you here, heard you were doing something with space or something crazy like that." I laughed, not because it was funny, but because the phrase space or something crazy like that was so perfectly, painfully familiar. It was exactly how Rachel had summarized my job to people for years. The kind of vague brush-off you give when someone's accomplishments make you feel small by comparison. "Just working," I replied, voice even, nothing crazy about it. He nodded, whistled low, and said, "Well, whatever it is, you look like you landed on your feet. You look like you're doing better than, well, most of us." And that was the moment I felt Rachel's presence behind me, not physically, but energetically, like a sudden drop in barometric pressure just before the rain starts. I turned my head slightly and, sure enough, there she was, smile taut, eyes scanning me like she was searching for the crack in the surface. It didn't take long for her to reclaim the space. She joined the circle with the kind of forced cheerfulness that only people who've lived off applause can pull off, looped her arm through Daniel's, and said, "Emma's had a big year," with that same voice she'd used at Thanksgiving 5 years ago. The one that dripped with praise while curdling it at the edges. She brought her job to my party like show and tell, but for grown-ups. The laugh that followed wasn't cruel. Exactly, it was casual, dismissive, like she was just kidding, but it landed hard, and I felt it thud in my chest the way a window rattles in the wind. And maybe a year ago, or 5 years ago, or 20, I would have done what I always did, laughed along, shrugged, disappeared quietly into the background so she could shine unbothered. But not now. Not after the long years of erasure, of silence, of working in the dark with no applause, no audience, just the constant quiet beat of self-belief. I turned to her slowly, met her eyes fully for the first time in years, and said, "I didn't bring my job, Rachel. You invited me. I just showed up as myself." The silence that followed was brief, maybe no more than 3 seconds, but it rang through the group like a dropped wine glass. Someone cleared their throat. Someone else took a sip. Jason, standing a few feet away, lifted his camera without thinking, and I heard the shutter click once, twice, and then a third time, soft and insistent. Rachel's smile stiffened, but she said nothing. Later, while I stood near the dessert table, poking at a plate of fruit tartlets and pretending not to listen, I heard two guests talking behind me, strangers, maybe friends of Rachel's from her brand partnership circle, whatever that meant. And one of them said, "That's her sister." The NASA one? God, I thought she'd be the one in the magazine, not Rachel. It wasn't loud, and it wasn't cruel, but it was honest, and that's what mattered. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. I just stood there, plate in hand, jacket zipped, mission patch gleaming quietly in the low afternoon light, and for the first time in a very long time, I felt something that didn't come from recognition or revenge or righteousness. It was something simpler, something deeper. I felt still. I felt real. And I felt like maybe, just maybe, I had finally stepped into the space I was always meant to occupy. Because in the end, the burn that leaves a mark isn't the one that explodes in fire and noise. It's the one that settles beneath the surface, slow and steady, impossible to erase. And that day, without raising my voice or lifting a finger, I left a scorch Rachel could feel, one that wouldn't blister until long after the party was over. It was somewhere between the third wave of compliments I politely deflected and the third glass of lemonade I sipped like it might buffer me against the rising tension in the air that I realized Rachel had stopped smiling. Not the performative smile she'd been wearing like stage makeup since the moment I stepped onto her manicured lawn, but the smile she used when she felt unchallenged, secure, fully certain that every set of eyes in the room, or in this case, the backyard, would always remain fixed on her. That smile, the one she'd carried effortlessly through childhood pageants, college presentations, Instagram live streams, and wedding expos, was gone. And in its place, behind her coral lip gloss and just slightly widened eyes, was the growing dread of someone who had built her identity on being the brightest light in every room, only to realize, too late, that someone else could glow without asking permission. Jason had taken another round of photos, this time by the stone fountain near the rear hedge, where the sunlight filtered through the trees in that soft, golden way that makes everything look cinematic. I hadn't asked for the attention, and I hadn't tried to hold it, but people had started orbiting around me as though something gravitational had shifted, not because I had claimed the spotlight, but because I had walked into the garden fully. Unapologetically myself, jacket zipped, posture tall, the quiet kind of proud that doesn't need explaining. People wanted to know about the commendation letter, which Jason had asked me to pose with discreetly, folded and held loosely in one hand, not because I wanted to wave it around like a trophy, but because it mattered to me. Because it was the physical embodiment of something no one in my family had ever truly acknowledged, that I wasn't chasing dreams out of some delusion, but because I had always known exactly what I was capable of, even when no one else could see it. Rachel tried, of course, to reclaim the moment the only way she knew how, by doubling down on charm, on visibility, on control. But charm can only hold so much weight when it's stretched thin over insecurity, and the more she smiled, the more her eyes betrayed her. She circled the groups like a woman chasing her own reflection, stepping into conversations she hadn't been invited into, laughing a little too loudly at jokes that weren't hers, and refilling half-empty glasses like a hostess desperate to prove she was still the one everyone had come to see. But the more she tried, the clearer it became to everyone, and maybe, painfully, to her most of all, that something had shifted, not dramatically, not with any grand announcement, but quietly and completely. Like a tide turning beneath your feet before you even notice the water's edge has moved. At one point, she cornered me near the garden trellis, out of earshot from the main group, but not so far that we couldn't still hear the murmur of voices, the clinking of glasses, the occasional burst of laughter that no longer centered around her. Her expression was tight, her voice quieter than usual, but her words carried the same edge they always had when she felt threatened, controlled, sugar-coated, but unmistakably sharp. "You couldn't just let me have this, could you?" she asked, arms folded across her torso, her painted nails digging lightly into the skin of her elbow. "You always have to make everything about you. This was supposed to be my day." I stared at her, honestly baffled by the absurdity of the accusation, not because it was cruel or surprising, but because it was so fundamentally disconnected from the reality of the day. I had come when she invited me. I had answered questions when asked. I had posed for photos when prompted. I had not raised my voice, not interrupted, not inserted myself into any moment that wasn't already handed to me. I had simply existed, and somehow, that had been enough to unseat her from the throne she thought no one else could ever touch. "I didn't make this about me, Rachel," I said, voice calm, steady, unshaken by her performance. "You invited me. I came. I didn't ask to be photographed. I didn't hand out resumes. I didn't bring a banner or a trophy or a slide deck. I wore my jacket because it's mine. I carried the letter because it's important to me. That's all." She scoffed, as if trying to summon back her usual condescension, but her eyes betrayed the fracture underneath, the way a frozen lake starts to crack long before it makes a sound. "You always act like you're better than everyone," she muttered, lower now, almost under her breath, but loud enough for me to catch every syllable. "Like you're the only one who's serious. The only one who matters." And that's when I realized what had been gnawing at her all along. It wasn't the jacket or the letter or even the attention. It was that I had something that didn't rely on likes or parties or curated perfection. I had substance. Quiet, consistent, undeniable substance. And it terrified her. "I never said I was better," I replied, not out of defensiveness, but because it was true. "I just stopped pretending I was less." That silence that followed was heavier than anything else that had happened that afternoon. It stretched between us like a drawbridge being slowly lowered between two castles that had stood too far apart for too long. She blinked, looked away, then back again, and for a moment I thought she might actually say something real, something vulnerable, something that reached past the rehearsed drama and found its way to truth. But the moment passed, and just like that, her expression hardened again. Before she could respond, Jason appeared, holding his phone in one hand and looking slightly winded, like he'd just come from chasing light through the garden paths. "Emma," he called, glancing between the two of us, clearly sensing the tension but stepping into it anyway, "you've got to see this. I posted one of your photos an hour ago, just a preview, and the NASA Twitter account just shared it. You're trending, like actually trending." Rachel didn't turn her head, but I could feel the impact of his words hit her like cold water thrown from behind. Jason showed me the screen, my image, in the jacket, standing against the ivy with the Commendation letter visible in one hand, a simple caption beneath it that read, "Real heroes don't always make headlines." Already it had over 9,000 likes and a couple hundred comments, most of them from women saying things like, "This is who our daughters need to see," and finally, someone real. I nodded slowly, handed the phone back, and thanked him, but I didn't gloat. I didn't grin. I didn't so much as glance toward Rachel. Because the truth was, I didn't need to. The moment had already done the speaking. And unlike Rachel, who had built a life out of choreographing attention, I had simply arrived, stood still, and let the truth settle. Later that evening, as the golden light faded and the guests began to thin out, I found myself sitting at the edge of the stone steps, watching the shadows grow long across the grass. Rachel remained near the drinks table, sipping the last of her white wine, her posture straighter than it had been all afternoon, but her smile was gone, replaced by something quieter, something thoughtful, maybe even regretful, though I didn't dare assume. And in that stillness, I didn't feel vindicated or victorious or even triumphant. I just felt done. Because revenge, real revenge, isn't loud. It's not about screaming matches or dramatic exits. It's about not needing to prove anything anymore. It's about watching the one who mocked you realize, in slow, dawning clarity, that they underestimated something they never took the time to understand. And that, more than anything, leaves a mark that doesn't fade. By the time the last of the daylight had drained from the sky and the garden party had begun its natural descent into that uncomfortable stretch of evening where people linger not because they want to, but because they're waiting for someone else to leave first, the mood had shifted in a way so subtle, so quiet, that it would have been almost invisible to someone not paying attention, except I was paying attention, not because I wanted to, but because years of being the unnoticed one had taught me how to read the room better than anyone else. The smiles had softened, the chatter had slowed, and though Rachel was still there at the center of it all, or at least pretending to be, she had lost the kind of gravitational pull she once commanded with such ease that I doubt she even noticed when it began to unravel. She stood near the edge of the patio, drink in hand, surrounded by 2 or 3 women who laughed politely at her stories, but glanced over her shoulder with increasing frequency, their eyes searching for something, someone, that now held more substance than the floral centerpieces or the cucumber water, or even the woman who had once claimed every beam of attention like it was her birthright. And I, standing near the pergola with Jason reviewing a few more shots on his camera, noticed how none of those glances landed on Rachel anymore, not in the way she was used to, not with adoration or envy or even curiosity. They passed over her the way people glance at a well-known product on a store shelf, familiar but unremarkable, while something new, something unexpected, catches their eye from the corner. My mother arrived then, late as always, her entrance dramatic without meaning to be, cheeks flushed from the heat, her heels clicking too loudly on the flagstone, her hair styled in the same way she had worn it since I was 12, as though holding onto a look might somehow freeze time. She scanned the yard with an expression that blended irritation with confusion, her eyes darting between faces until they finally landed on Rachel, and without so much as a greeting, she said loudly enough for half the guests to hear, "Why is everyone standing around Emma?" I didn't move. I didn't respond. I simply watched as Rachel froze mid-pour, the bottle of Prosecco paused above a guest's glass, her knuckles whitening slightly around the neck of the bottle. Our mother wasn't being cruel. She was simply being herself, blunt, unaware, and completely devoid of tact. But her words cut through the already fragile atmosphere like a blade, and for one suspended breath, the entire party seemed to hold still. Rachel turned slowly, her smile already slipping, her eyes landing on me with a look that was neither anger nor sorrow, but something far more unsettling, disbelief. As if even now, even after everything, she couldn't quite accept that I had become someone people wanted to talk to learn from, to photograph, not because I had asked for it, but because I had earned it. I watched her try to recover, watched her smile stretch too wide, her voice rise half a pitch as she welcomed our mother with exaggerated warmth, as though that might erase the moment that had just passed. But our mother, never one for reading the room, walked straight to me and said, "So what is all this I'm hearing about NASA? I thought you worked at some data company." Her words weren't accusatory, just laced with the kind of benign ignorance that had followed me my entire life. I smiled, not bitterly, not even sadly, but with a kind of practiced patience I had perfected over decades of family gatherings where my accomplishments had been treated like background noise. "I work in aerospace analytics," I said, clearly but gently. "NASA commended my team last month. Our work helped recover data from a compromised mission feed. It's a long story, but a good one." I could feel Rachel's silence like a pressure drop behind me, as though the very air she was breathing had become heavier. Our mother blinked, nodded, and said, "Well, I guess that's impressive," before turning back toward Rachel and asking, "Why didn't you tell me she was doing something real?" That was the breaking point, not a loud explosion or a public meltdown, but the quiet, private snap of something internal. Rachel didn't respond. She simply placed the bottle down too hard on the table, the glass clinking with a sharpness that made a few people glance over. Then she walked away without a word, disappearing into the house like a magician retreating backstage after a trick failed to land. I didn't follow her. I didn't need to. Instead, I remained in the garden, talking to the people who remained, answering their questions with the same calm clarity I'd given every time someone asked what it meant to work in a field they didn't understand, and gradually, one by one, the guests filtered out, leaving behind only the half-eaten plates, the dying buzz of conversation, and the feeling that something had shifted permanently in the foundation of everything my sister had tried to build. Eventually, as the night wound down and the caterers began packing up trays and folding linen napkins with mechanical precision, I found myself alone near the garden wall, my jacket still zipped, my commendation letter now folded neatly back into my purse, the buzz of attention having faded to something quieter, something warmer, respect, maybe, or simply recognition. That's when Rachel reappeared, her footsteps softer now, her expression unreadable, her posture stiffer than it had been earlier, as though bracing against the kind of vulnerability she wasn't used to showing. She stopped a few feet from me and crossed her arms, not in defiance, but in defense, and when she finally spoke, her voice was low, not bitter, but bruised. "I just wanted today to be mine," she said. "I worked hard for this. You show up out of nowhere, and suddenly I don't even recognize my own party." I looked at her then, not with pity, not with anger, but with the kind of understanding that comes from years of silence, years of swallowing the hurt so someone else could keep believing they were the only one who mattered. "You built something beautiful, Rachel," I said softly. "But I didn't come here to take it from you. I came because I finally realized I didn't need to keep hiding in order to love what I do." She looked away, blinking rapidly, her mouth pressing into a line that trembled for just a moment before she turned and walked back toward the house. No apology. No reconciliation. Just distance. And honestly, I didn't need more than that. Sometimes closure isn't a clean ending. It's simply recognizing that some things will never be what they should have been. I walked out of that garden not as the winner of some unspoken contest, not as the dramatic victor of a sibling rivalry decades in the making, but as someone who had stopped apologizing for taking up space, for speaking clearly, for showing up in full. And while Rachel would go back to her curated photos and carefully posed smiles, I would go back to work on Monday, hang my jacket on the hook by my desk, and feel the quiet, steady satisfaction of a life built on more than applause. She called me a nobody for years, but now she can't even look me in the eye. And the beautiful thing is, I don't need her to.